Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Off Your Gord. Today is Friday, April the 18th, 2025. We've got a loaded show today. It's the springtime. April showers are bringing May flowers. We got a lot to talk about. First, we're going to go through the NBA playoffs because that's starting up. Then we're going to go through the NHL playoffs because that's starting up at the same time. We got a busy sports kind of month coming up. It's going to be crazy. And then we've got a few other topics to talk about. The NFL draft is coming up. I already did my mock draft, but things are changing. New developments are being made. We're starting to find out more things, so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally, we're going to end today's show on a little bit of a sad note. There is something I do want to talk about that recently happened in the world of college football, and I guess sort of the NFL draft as well. So first off, we're going to talk about the NBA playoffs. The NBA playoffs is about to be in full swing. The NCAA tournament in college saw some wild moments with March Madness. The Florida Gators emerged victorious in the men's bracket, and in the women's bracket, it was the UConn Huskies once again, continuing their long-running 20-year dynasty at this point. But now that college is wrapped up, it's time to start up the NBA playoffs. There's a lot of really compelling storylines going on in the world of basketball, and we're going to talk about them here today. We're going to start off with the play-in tournament. First off, the Kings versus the Dallas Mavericks. The fact that the Dallas Mavericks even snuck into this thing is an accomplishment in its own. I think you'd be better off if they were in the draft lottery, to be honest, and had missed the playoffs, because to suffice it to say, I kind of tore them a new one in another edition of this show. They've been a disaster lately. Kyrie Irving is and Anthony Davis are on a sinking ship. They got rid of Luka, and they're just making really terrible decisions and upsetting the fans. But they snuck into the play-in tournament. They took on the Sacramento Kings, and they actually emerged victorious over the Kings. But I guess you could make the argument they're kind of living on borrowed time at this point. The Kings are in kind of a weird spot. You've got DeMar DeRozan playing there. You've got De'Aaron Fox. Actually, my bad. De'Aaron Fox had been traded, but the Kings are in a weird spot right now. I think a lot of people saw them as future champions of the sport. Honestly, just a couple of years ago, they were the 3 seed in the West, flying high. They ended up losing that series to the Warriors that I think a lot of people expected them to win. It kind of killed their momentum. But, that's as far as that matchup goes. Then we got the Golden State Warriors and the Memphis Grizzlies. And, when it comes to the Warriors, I've honestly had this weird kind of change of heart involving them. It started off in the mid-2010s. I was kind of sick of them. I think everybody was. They were winning so much. They had the best record in NBA history, or damn near close to it. Then they signed Kevin Durant, which they didn't need, but Kevin kind of turned into a bad guy and just joined the Warriors and made this super team, and they won more championships. And then when everybody thought their dynasty was over, they win another one over the Celtics. And it's like, I think there was a bit of that Warriors burnout, but we're kind of seeing like a shift with the way the Warriors have been perceived. Myself, definitely feeling that. The Warriors are now kind of the lovable underdogs. They had such a tumultuous season where they frankly looked like they were going to miss the playoffs, miss the play-in tournament altogether, and they rallied. I think they had like a crazy win streak or something. I think it was like 12 wins in a row or something like that, and they really hunkered down, did what champions do, and that's the part that matters. There is that the former champion, they still have a lot of that kind of capability left in them to turn it on when it counts. And they played the Memphis Grizzlies and actually beat the Memphis Grizzlies. That game kind of went down to the wire. It wasn't as close as the score would indicate. The Grizzlies kind of came back into it late, but the Warriors do what dynasties do. Next up, I want to talk about the Chicago Bulls and the Miami Heat. The Bulls, had a good season. I think we're seeing kind of a changing of the guard in that division in the East. The Bulls are kind of on their way up. The Pistons are on their way up, and the Bucks, kind of getting a little older, a little more injured. We saw that a lot this season. The Pacers, same thing, getting a little older. the Bulls had a good season. Miami Heat, in that game, we saw Tyler Herro have an incredible game, showing up when it counts. The Heat still in kind of a weird spot post Jimmy Butler. Not really, they're a team kind of trying to find its identity, but if you get more performances from your young stars like Tyler Herro like that, we're sure to see them kind of reload rather than rebuild in short order. And finally, the Orlando Magic versus the Atlanta Hawks. I love everything about this. You've got two of my favorite personal stars in basketball. You've got Trae Young for the Hawks and Paolo Banchero for the Orlando Magic. And Banchero, let me look up his stats. He's been incredible this season. I think he's, a lot of people kind of forget that he was a first overall pick. He's one of the more forgotten first overall picks in NBA history. But this season, he's been averaging 25 points. He didn't go crazy against the Hawks. He only put up about 17 points, but he's a future face of the league for many years to come. One of my favorite players personally in all of basketball. Now let's just talk about individual playoff teams. The guys that are looking to the seeds that are looking to play the play-in tournament teams that advance from that. You've got the Oklahoma City Thunder. One of my favorite stories in the last 5 years, 6 years, 8 years, 10 years, and whatever amount of years you want to put on it in basketball. The Thunder have done everything the right way. I think in an era where there's kind of this burnout when it comes to guys going to teams to join up with other stars and just free agency and all this, and players get to just kind of go wherever they want and create super teams. And obviously you're going to see teams like the Lakers and the Clippers and the Nets and the Knicks and all these entertainment hotspots like the Heat and things like that. You're going to see these big hotspots where players would want to go, kind of have this weird unfair advantage. It's always cool when you have a team like the Thunder that hasn't done that, but is instead kind of built themselves in-house, drafted well. They have a great general manager who gets them a litany of picks every year, and can, in any sport, having a great general manager is always an advantage. But having a general manager as good as the one that the Thunders have is invaluable. He is really special, and he has set them up well for many, many years to come. You've got guys like Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. You've got Chet Holmgren, just guys that can really carry a franchise, and they're rewarded for it. They're the number one seed, pretty dominant this entire season, one of the better records in quite some time. And they're going to start off the playoffs, and I think they could come close to, if not make it all the way to the dance. Another team out of the West, I think, is another great story, honestly, similar to the Thunder, drafted well, didn't really have to bring in many stars, just kind of work their way up from the ground up, is the Houston Rockets. It wasn't very long ago that this team was a complete disaster. They were terrible, post James Harden, post Chris Paul, after those big stars that left, they were kind of trying to find their identity again, and boy, have they found it. They're the number 2 seed in the West, and looking to make a deep playoff run. I think they're a little young. I wouldn't be surprised if one of these more gritty teams lower in the seedings comes into Houston and in a 7-game series and does eventually get the best of them. But there's young teams always kind of have that, and I think once this team starts to really get their reps in the playoffs and kind of learn what playoff basketball is really about, I think we're going to see big things for the Houston Rockets. Now let's shift over to the East. The Cleveland Cavaliers were the number 1 seed. And this team is just dominant. This team is dynamite. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago on the show that there's only really like 3 or 4 teams in each conference that I think have a genuine shot at winning the title, and why that I think that's a good thing. And the Cavaliers are really just something to watch. They got Darius Garland. You've got Donovan Mitchell. Just guys that make basketball really fun to watch. I think. It's a 3-point shooting game now, and you got 2 great shooters on that team, and just a whole very deep roster of stars. And the Cleveland Cavaliers, I think any betting man would say that they're going to make a deep playoff run. Next, the Boston Celtics. they're just a machine. No other way to put it. Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, guys like that are just, they put their heads down. There's all this talk in the media. They always just put their heads down and go win championships and go win games and go win big playoff series. And they're going to do that again this year. I have no doubt in my mind. The defending NBA champions, they're looking to go back to back. And, I think they're going to make a deep run at it, if not pull it off. Next up, I want to talk about some individual matchups here in these playoffs. You got the Denver Nuggets versus the Los Angeles Clippers. Nikola Jokic just gets better and better. He's like a fine wine. Yeah, with age, every year, it seems like Nikola Jokic, he wins MVP, and you're thinking, oh, this is the peak. And he wins MVP again with an even better season. This is the peak. This season, averaging a triple-double, he's the MVP. There's no other way about it. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. Nikola Jokic is just a force to be reckoned with, and he will be a force to be reckoned with for years and years to come. They're taking on the Clippers. I think, as much as I do like what the Clippers got going on, I think that it's a young team. This is Denver's series to lose. I think they'll make pretty short work of the Clippers. I'm not saying it'll be a sweep, but I could see 5 or 6 games. Next up, we got personally the series that I'm looking forward to the most. The Los Angeles Lakers take on the Minnesota Timberwolves. Just a whole group of stars on both of these teams that I love. You're seeing this LeBron and Luka Doncic pairing really hit the ground running. Luka was traded to the Los Angeles Lakers, and boy, did that team just immediately turn on the Jets, winning a ton of games. I think they wound up as the 3 seed. Taking on the Timberwolves, who I think I think a lot of people, myself included, expected them to be a little better. They're in kind of a weird transitional period. You've got Anthony Edwards, that's your big star, but you lose guys like Karl Anthony Towns, and I think myself being the biggest fan of this team a couple of years ago, I really thought they were going to turn on the Jets and potentially compete for a championship. That didn't quite happen, but I think the Lakers are going to win this series, and you'll see why when we get to the bottom of my predictions here, but I wouldn't be surprised if the Timberwolves give them a good shot at it. I could see this going 7 games, honestly. Next up, we've got the Indiana Pacers versus the Milwaukee Bucks. The Milwaukee Bucks, what can you say about this team other than perseverance? Damian Lillard, former Portland Trail Blazer, current Milwaukee Buck, has been dealing with blood clot issues for the past couple of months. That's serious. He's missed obviously a ton of games from that, and they've had to adjust to that. Giannis, as great as Giannis has been, former champion with the Bucks, the year they beat the Suns, he's starting to show some age. So there's a gritty veteran team that I think could pull off some upsets really in this series. I think they're the 5th seed coming in, and they're gonna. I do think they will beat the Pacers. And where they go from that is up, is just up to the way it falls. I wouldn't pick them to win the title, but I wouldn't bet against them either. Finally, as far as matchups go, we get the New York Knicks versus the Detroit Pistons. Just an amazingly entertaining series. The Knicks, you've got Jalen Brunson and Karl Anthony Towns, the big stars in the Big Apple, and they've been great to watch. Karl Anthony Towns, I hate to put in all this bias into the show, but my favorite player in basketball, Karl Anthony Towns. I've always been a big fan of his. So seeing him, go to New York from Minnesota and just be this successful, be this big star in this big city has been really cool to see. And the Detroit Pistons, what a story. Worst team in basketball by far last year. There was a time last year where they were 3-33, if you'd believe it. They were absolutely terrible. And they fired the coach, and they made some important moves in the offseason, and wow, they're in the playoffs now. How crazy is that? Former number 1 pick, Cade Cunningham, has had an incredible season. He's really emerged into that top star for a team that desperately needed one, and they've had a lot of great performances from a lot of great young players, but they've kind of done this off of him, and it's been really cool to see the Pistons make it this far. So that's all the teams in the NBA playoffs, but let's talk about my championship prediction. I kind of mulled this one over. This was a tough one for me. In years past, I had said certain teams like the 76ers and things like that, and I'd been burned by them. I'd picked the Utah Jazz a couple of years ago, got burned by them. When the Nets had their big trifecta, I picked them to win the title, and I've been getting burned pretty badly when it comes to my NBA predictions. Much different than my NFL predictions, where I feel like I've had a pretty good record at that. Not so much in basketball, but that being said, I think I'm going to try and reel it in a little bit, go a little bit normal, a little bit more normal, so to speak, with my picks. I'm going to say it's going to be the Los Angeles Lakers taking on the Cleveland Cavaliers. Besides the fact that this makes for an amazing series, let's talk about the story that this would be. Cleveland, many know, the former home of LeBron James, the current Lakers star. How cool would it be for LeBron to have the opportunity to play against the Cavaliers for all the marbles? And I think it will be the Lakers winning the title. The Lakers are my pick this year. I know that they're not the most popular choice. They're only a 3 seed. I think a lot of people would want to, maybe go with the 2 seed or the 1 seed in both of these conferences. But I think this is the Lakers' year once again. LeBron gets number 5 and really starts creeping up on Michael Jordan. I think you could make the argument now that with just 4 titles, LeBron has equaled to or bested Jordan in the GOAT conversation. But if he wins the 5th one, then you got to really start having some tough conversations. And I do think this is his year where he wins a 5th one. And, this has been the NBA playoffs. We've got a lot to look forward to in the NBA. Let's switch to the other playoffs that are starting up. We've got the NHL playoffs. Much like the playoffs in the NBA, this is kicking off in the spring. It's hockey season starts around the same time. The playoffs start around the same time as well. It's been a really exciting hockey season. We're seeing a lot of teams make it to the dance that haven't quite been able to reach it. So it's cool to see kind of like a reset of or a changing of the guard, so to speak. As interesting as all the teams that made the playoffs in the NHL are this year, so too are the teams that missed the NHL playoffs. It was the first time in NHL history that both the Rangers, the Bruins, and the Penguins all missed the playoffs in the same year. That's never happened before. And if you think about it, it makes sense. The years the Penguins were winning all those championships, we saw them win 2 straight. The Bruins were there. The Rangers were always there. They're always kind of making the playoffs. Like if one of them makes the playoffs, usually one of the others will as well. And those 3 teams have all been, well run for so many years. But unfortunately for all them, they missed the playoffs this year. The Penguins just was a case of getting old. You got guys like Crosby getting into the twilight of their careers, and guys like teams like the Bruins making moves that made no sense to me, trading basically everybody, trying to rebuild in short order. But I don't know if an in-season rebuild is the way to go with them, but that's the route that they chose. The final spot in these NHL playoffs did come down to a really close battle in the East between the Montreal Canadiens and the Columbus Blue Jackets. And in the end, it was the Canadiens that ended up taking the spot. The Blue Jackets, unfortunately for them, are going home, but we have got our playoffs ready to go, raring to go. It's going to be the Winnipeg Jets versus the St. Louis Blues. Not much you can really say about this series other than it's sure to be a good one. I'm going to go with the Jets winning it, but the Blues, this is a team that knows how to win championships. 2019 Stanley Cup champions looking to win another one. Dallas Stars versus Colorado Avalanche. The Avalanche, same thing as the Blues. Know what it's like to be here. This team has got playoff experience. This team has championship winning experience. The Stars were this close to having championship winning experience. They've come up just short in the past, losing in the Stanley Cup final. They look to kind of get that monkey off their back and pull it off. The Vegas Golden Knights, they've, I think, in my opinion, the benchmark for how to run an NHL franchise. They've been in the league as a team existing for less than 10 years. And, they've already made multiple Stanley Cup finals. They've already been Stanley Cup champion. And they're looking to win another one, and I think they'd be a good prediction. They're not my prediction to win the title, but if you're telling me that in these next couple months that it's Vegas that ends up pulling it off again and winning already their 2nd Stanley Cup final, I would not be shocked at all. They take on the Minnesota Wild, team that I've always thought has had a little bit of an issue living up to expectations. Maybe they shake the monkey off their back this year, but I don't think they do. I think the Golden Knights are going to continue to be the machine that they've been. Next up, we've got the higher-seeded Los Angeles Kings versus the Edmonton Oilers. The Kings just put their heads down and go win games. Maybe not as strong of a powerhouse as they were when they were winning those championships. Beating the Rangers in the Stanley Cup final those years back. But they're always talented. They're always seem to be in that conversation. They take on the Edmonton Oilers, last year's runner-up. They ended up losing a close, hard-fought series to the Florida Panthers. And, Connor McDavid and the Oilers, they're trying to avenge that defeat this year. Interestingly enough, Florida did lose the Stanley Cup final the year before last year and ended up winning it. Maybe we see that same trend continue for the Oilers. They lose last year, maybe come back this year and win it. Next up, the Toronto Maple Leafs versus the Ottawa Senators. Now, this is, we got your All-Canada series, right? The Ottawa Senators have been a dumpster fire for a ton of years. So, honestly, seeing them finally just hunker down and get their way into the postseason after so many years and after so much hardship that these Ottawa fans have faced, it's really cool to see them back. They take on the Maple Leafs, who I think are thanking their lucky stars that Boston is out of the playoffs and not in the dance, because it seems like every year, whether Toronto has got one of the best records in hockey or barely squeaks into the playoffs, it seems like every year they run into the Bruins and every year the Bruins beat them. And that's changed a little bit in recent years. The Bruins haven't been able to beat them, but obviously the Lightning, or not the Lightning, sorry, the Maple Leafs, even though they've been in the playoffs, still haven't done much in the playoffs. I think they look to change that this year, and I think they will change that this year. You'll see why coming up. Next up, we've got the Tampa Bay Lightning versus the Florida Panthers. These two teams know each other really well. Feels like this is like the first round that they've played against each other in. The Lightning are trying to continue their dynasty. Interestingly enough, I always kind of have found it interesting that these two teams are close division rivals. They always have this big rivalry going on during the season. They always find each other in the playoffs too. The Lightning, they had gone back-to-back a few years back, made a third, ended up losing that one to the Avalanche. They look to just continue their dynasty and win a third Stanley Cup final in a very short amount of years. And the Panthers are trying to kind of kickstart a dynasty of their own. They're trying to do, honestly, the reverse of what the Lightning did. They lost the finals. They won it last year. They're trying to go back-to-back this year. So they're trying to kickstart their dynasty in Florida, while the Lightning are trying to reactivate their dynasty in Florida. Next up, we've got the Washington Capitals versus the Montreal Canadiens. What's so cool about this series to me is it's old school versus new school. You saw for so many years the Capitals couldn't get it done, and then they would always run into a team like the Penguins or the Bruins in the playoffs and wouldn't be able to pull it off. But they finally did. They won it in 2018, and it was so cool seeing Alex Ovechkin get that success, that championship that he was looking for. And he's continuing to age like a fine wine. He's no player that he once was, but he's still an extremely talented player, and he recently broke the record for most goals in NHL history, finally passing Wayne Gretzky. Gretzky obviously still probably the GOAT, Gretzky leading so much in every other stat, but Alex Ovechkin, you gotta think, is top three of all time, top three hockey player of all time. So Ovi continues to be a record breaker. Now let's talk about the Canadiens of that matchup. They barely made the playoffs. It was coming down to it. Them and the Blue Jackets, and they ended up pulling it off. What's interesting about the Canadiens, they're statistically, age-wise, you take all the players on the roster, you average out their ages, they're the youngest playoff team in NHL history. So there's that old school with Ovechkin and all those stars from Washington. When you got the new school with the Montreal Canadiens, so it's interesting to kind of. It seems like there's always that one matchup every year in any sport in the playoffs. When the playoffs get down to it, where it's the old veteran team of scrappy veterans versus the young bucks, so to speak, and it's interesting to kind of see that here between Montreal and Washington. Finally, to end off the first round, you've got the Carolina Hurricanes versus the New Jersey Devils. These are two teams that it's kind of like a prove-it year. I think both of these teams, they've had a lot of success in recent years, not a lot of championships to show for, not any championships to show for it in recent years. I think one of these teams, just to kind of silence the doubters, so to speak, needs to make at the very least a deep playoff run. I know a lot of people have the Carolina Hurricanes as their championship prediction. I personally do not. With that, let's get into my championship prediction. For years and years, we haven't seen a Canadian team win the Stanley Cup final. We've seen Canadian teams participate in the Stanley Cup final. Last year you saw the Edmonton Oilers lose a close series to the Florida Panthers. A couple of years ago, you saw the Canadiens come up short against the Lightning, in that weird COVID year where we were seeing the divisions get changed around due to COVID policies. So it was kind of weird finals because, nowadays, obviously, the Lightning and the Canadiens could not play in the finals. They're not in the same conference, but they did in that year. And, the Canadiens came up short. And, but as far as it goes, we just haven't seen very many Canada teams competing in the Stanley Cup final. After the Canadiens a couple of years ago, you have to go all the way back to 2011 when it was the Vancouver Canucks. So, it's been quite some time since we've seen a team from Canada win the Stanley Cup final, and we haven't seen many of them compete in it. The last time a Canada team won the Stanley Cup final was the Montreal Canadiens in 1993. So, what is my tangent about this all about? Why am I talking about Canada teams, winning the Stanley Cup, other than that I have a Canada team winning the Stanley Cup this year? Not only do I have the Canada team winning the Stanley Cup, I have both Canada teams in the Stanley Cup. I think we're guaranteed a Canadian winner under my predictions. I think it'll be the Edmonton Oilers looking to avenge last year's loss versus the Toronto Maple Leafs. So when that series starts, we're guaranteed a Canada Stanley Cup champion for the first time in over 30 years at this point. I think we're going to see it. Both of these teams are really good. Connor McDavid's an absolute legend of the game, and he's trying to make it, but I don't have them winning. I think this is the Toronto Maple Leafs year. Their biggest adversaries are out of the playoffs, and the only thing there to stop them is themselves, which they've done in the past. So I'm a little apprehensive, but I think this is Toronto's year to get it done. And we've got the NFL draft coming up recently. So we've talked about hockey, we've talked about basketball. Let's talk about the NFL draft now a little more. We're not going to do a mock draft again. That show came and went. You can look at it. You can look it up on YouTube. It's there for you to watch. I did all 32 first round picks. Kind of some things changing right now. We're seeing a lot of guys declare that they're going to be there in person to walk the stage, which is always kind of an indicator of their agent kind of telling them, oh, well, you're going to go high in the first round. We think you're going to be a high draft pick. You should probably show up and walk the stage. Versus maybe some guys that you anticipate falling in the draft might stay home. We're seeing Jackson Dart, quarterback out of Ole Miss, staying home. You could argue he maybe expects to fall a little bit in the draft, maybe even fall out of the first round. Who knows? The Saints, I had them taking Shedeur Sanders. I'm absolutely having them take Shedeur Sanders now because we recently found out Derek Carr is having issues with his throwing shoulder. And unfortunately for him, that may sideline him all of next season, which would be a big loss for the Saints. So they kind of need a quarterback. What better way to replace that than start getting Shedeur Sanders and start getting him ready to take the reins eventually. Finally, we've talked about the NFL draft, and there's a lot of players whose dreams are about to get made next week. The draft is 6 days away, and we're going to see a lot of players' dreams come true. They've all been working for. Unfortunately, one player will not be achieving those dreams. Kyren Lacy, the wide receiver out of LSU, he had some legal issues. We don't need to talk too much about them, where he had been involved in a hit-and-run incident that had left somebody killed. He had his legal issues in that regard. Unfortunately, he was found dead in his car after his family had reported that he was acting erratically, and he had ran away from the house, got into his car. Police were called, and he had unfortunately taken his own life. Just tragedy. He was. A lot of people expected him to be pretty highly sought after in the draft, and his dreams were gonna come true. He was gonna make the NFL. Probably have a very solid career. He's a very talented wide receiver. Those LSU Tiger wide receivers are always really good. Unfortunately, Lacy was really trying to turn around his situation, and just kind of, make it better for himself. And unfortunately, obviously football has lost a great athlete. The world has lost a great young man. With this being a suicide and everything, just always, if you or anybody is struggling, call that 988 number. They've in recent years they've shortened the suicide hotline to make it easier to call, to make it easier to have access to for people that might not have access. So just always ask for help. Sorry to end on such a serious note of today's show, but it's an important thing. I wanted to make sure I talked about it because I know it's been a tragedy. A lot of people have been talking about it in NFL circles lately, and it's a tough scenario, So I'm sure a lot of his LSU teammates that will get drafted on Sunday. Will Campbell looks to go high in the first round. I'm sure we'll see a lot of his former teammates paying tribute to him on this week's Thursday, the first round of the draft, all through the Friday and Saturday, the later rounds. So. That has been today's episode of Off Your Gord. If you enjoyed the episode, make sure to tune in for more episodes. We do this show every week. We talk about the latest and greatest stories in sports. Sometimes serious stories like we've talked about today, but we're always here to kind of give you the rundown of what's going on in the sports world. This has been Off Your Gord. I am your host, Jeffrey Gordon. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys next week for next week's episode. We're going to have a lot to talk about. See you then.